as much as I wish, and as much as every Catholic wish, we would have direct, unequivocal evidence that God exists, it would be so nice if we could just lay it out on the table. As our Holy Father Pope Benedict says himself, we can't just get our arguments, lay them on the table, and prove it to the non-believer once and for all. But what we can do, I believe, using Ed's term evidence, is looking at all the evidence, and what I call in the legal profession circumstantial evidence. You know, when I was prosecuting criminals in the Fulton County DA's office, Nancy Grace, who's now on TV, used to always say, "I'll take a circumstantial case any day." And the point is, if you look at all the circumstances and put it all together, sometimes it really does make a case. And again, because we only have 15 minutes, I'm going to go right into my argument. I'm going to do so philosophically, existentially, and then scientifically. First, philosophically. I know that's a big word. It comes from two Greek words, love of wisdom. And what I want us to do is just from the very big picture, think about the two competing philosophies we have tonight. We really do have two opposing ideologies. The Catholic philosophy of life is that when we look at all of reality, when we ask the very hard questions, when we think big, we are left with the conclusion that ultimately reality in each and every one of us owes our being to God, whom we believe is the first cause, the ultimate reason of all created beings. The Catechism of the Catholic Church goes into kind of detail about what we do when we come out with this theory. And the Catechism says, the world and man attest that we are not it. There has to be a reason for our existence beyond ourselves. And the Catechism teaches us that we reflect and we are grounded in being itself, ultimate reality. So we come to know philosophically that there is a first cause of the universe, and we call that God. Now, for any of you specialists out there that might read some of these books or might have read Richard Dawkins' book, we Catholics aren't talking about first cause just in the Aristotelian sense. We don't say everything has a cause, so you go back to the first dynamic in the string of events, and that's God. Our view of God is not sort of as the billiard player. Rather, our view is that God ultimately creates and sustains us. You see, even as we sit here right now, we're going to get into the beginning of time a little bit later, but as we sit here right now, if it weren't for God, the ultimate cause of our being, we would cease to exist. A great philosopher, Martin Heidegger, wrote a book, Being and Nothingness, and that's what it comes down to for the Catholic. We believe all of reality is in God's hands. We're speaking metaphorically, but God is taking care of us. Without God, we cease to exist. That, we believe, is a very reasonable, broad approach. I know a lot of you would rather have a lot more details. That's generally the thrust of our philosophical disposition. Now, we contrast that with the atheist disposition. What is the atheist philosophy? Well, the bedrock of the atheist philosophy is what we call materialism. And there may be some experts and scientists that distinguish between materialism and naturalism, and frankly, again, Ed and I haven't discussed all this. I don't know how he's going to play with that. But from my perspective, with all due respect, I don't really see a difference. Like in the legal profession, sometimes we say there may be a distinction without a difference. Basically, from the atheist point of view, their philosophy is all of reality boils down to what can be explained either physically or naturally. So it has to be scientific, physical, or natural. That's the ultimate explanation of all of reality. Well, the problem with materialism as a philosophy is that it's sort of internally inconsistent. As G.K. Chesterton once said, you know, it's easy being an atheist in theory, but it's hard in the day-to-day activity. Because time and time again, if you have a materialist philosophy, you're going to act contrary to that. One example that comes to mind is in the 19th century, there was three physiologists, three scientists. And in their studies and in their experiments, they became so excited because they concluded all of reality boiled down to materialism. And they adopted materialism as their way of being. And they pledged an oath to each other. It was very formal. They pledged an oath and they said, we will promise, we will commit to atheism, to materialism. And we promise each other, and we're going to rely on each other to maintain this throughout our careers. And so they did. But you see, in making that oath and trusting the other scientists, and making a pact that goes beyond their labs in the science room, they were embracing something that transcended all of them. A pact, oath. They relied on something that was intangible, which cannot be reduced and cannot be explained by materialism. Cardinal Schoenbaum, one of the greatest cardinals of the church who's really spent a lot of time on this, reflects that materialism cannot be maintained as a way of thinking, for he says it's inherently contradictory. First, yes, as a matter of method, a scientist can say only that which can be described materially is reality. But in blanking out man's reasoning, and blanketing out the remainder of philosophy, and blanketing out so many other aspects of the way to reason, that limitation itself was a decision of the mind. You see, when the scientist or the materialist says, we're only going to accept what is material as the grounding of all of existence, when they make that decision, they're defying their own philosophical notion right from the get-go. It's inconsistent. Now, I know that we could talk about this for hours and days, but basically, I submit there's two opposing philosophies. Our philosophy, which believes God is the first reason and the ultimate ground of all of existence, or the atheist, materialistic view. It comes down to this. Each of us must decide once and for all. Either God is the most reasonable explanation for your existence, or you are the random and pointless product of material processes, and you have no soul within you. I submit, philosophically speaking, that the Catholic view there is a God is more reasonable than the atheist materialism. Therefore, philosophically, I submit, and again, this in and of itself may not carry the day, but it's very important to get going looking at the big picture. I submit, philosophically speaking, it's more reasonable to go with the Catholic point of view. Now we move to the existential, which is probably the most interesting, because when you look at human existence, there's so many parts of human existence that we can agree with our atheist guests. There's so many aspects that we can agree of reality. We can say, yeah, that happens. That's human nature. And then we can argue, which I think is fascinating. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm going to try to cover just a few aspects. First, generally speaking, morality and ethics. If you read Dr. Dawkins' book, and I'm sure Ed was going to make some points tonight, he makes a big deal to say atheists can act ethically. And we Catholics say, amen, that's the way it should be. See, we Catholics, for really our entire existence, have always held there is a natural moral order to things. We call it natural law. And the Catholic Church has always said that can be known, and it's written in the heart of every human being from the beginning of time. Even before Jesus Christ became man, every person on earth had the ability to know that there was a law written in their hearts. There was a universal guiding principle. And so when the atheists say, we act morally, we say, yes, you do. There is a natural law. I submit two quick examples where I think the atheists have tapped into it. Now, I know you don't agree it exists. For example, just real briefly, Ed and I, Ed has trusted me. Ed is a good man. I trust Ed. We have formed sort of an alliance. We have completely diametrically opposing philosophies, and we both feel very serious about them. But yet, he knows what he can trust. And he says it's the right thing to do. There is a transcendental reality between Ed and me, and it's called the natural moral order, natural law. I don't know if any of you atheist guests went to the atheist convention. Real quick, any of y'all went to the convention? Well, I'd like to say that when you were in line getting ready to have your book signed by Dr. Dawkins, you were extremely polite to each other. You were extremely orderly. You acted more Christian than most Christians. There was a sense that that's the way you do things. And I tested it just to have a little fun. I acted like I was going to break in line. And y'all were nice, but politely said, there is a line. Here we go. And I'm submitting that there's something that can be known to every person. Now, the big point of Richard Dawkins' book, and trust me, I'm not an expert on this, and I hope I don't mind opening the door, but I do want to point out one thing. Dr. Dawkins says, if we get our morality from religion, then they must be the same. And he points to scientific studies that say, given the same dilemma, the atheists acted more or less the same as the Christians. And then he concludes, therefore, Christianity is a delusion. But I said, not so fast, Dr. Dawkins. You're proving our point. We have always said everybody is able to tap into the universal norms, the universal way of acting. You're not disproving our faith. You're actually making our point. The second problem with Dr. Dawkins' assessment is that it presupposes the whole Catholic view or the Christian point of view is merely just an ethical system. We don't go to church to get a little code book to show us how to act. We go to church to encounter Jesus of Nazareth, the center, the history of the universe, the end and the beginning, and the Alpha and the Omega. So in criticizing it, in the critics of Catholicism, you can take on some of the things we've done, but we're not just an ethical system. So I submit, and I've gotten a little bit off here, I submit that when you look at it, when you look at the fact that you do have a natural moral order, when you do have natural law, it's more reasonable to conclude that that's why everybody can act according with universal norms. Now, the second aspect of the human condition that I think shows that Catholicism is more reasonable than atheism is the phenomena that humans can act against their self-interest. Time and time again, throughout history, we see individual humans acting in a way contrary to their own self-interest. Now, I know the scientists tell us that this is either a direct product or some sort of byproduct or some sort of tertiary result of Darwinian evolution, and natural selection causes these realities. But I'm just submitting to your plain common sense. Why would a human go against their own interest? Why sacrifice? If you're predetermined from the get-go through natural selection, what aspect of natural selection makes you make such heroic sacrifices? The great author Graham Greene wrote a book called 10th Man. It was based on what the Nazis did, this evil act of what they did when their soldiers were in their camps. They'd kill every 10th soldier, and they would make them pick these little sticks. And one time, the man who picked the stick that destined him to death had a look of horror on his face. And the guy next to him said, you know what, I've seen the picture of your children. You have a reason to live. I'm going to take the stick. And that soldier took the stick and died. What in Darwinian natural selection would prompt that man to do it? And what in Darwin's name would the other 8 act the way they would? Some of the other 8 said, that should have been me. I should have been heroic. Some of them were cowardice. I submit that when you assess that type of sacrifice, that the Catholic notion of sacrificing makes a lot more sense than merely concluding it's the random result of Darwinian natural selection. Moving along, beauty, art, music. Dr. Dawkins makes a big deal to say that we get too excited about art and music, and anybody, any group can produce great musicians, but that's missing the whole point. The point is, Mozart, Haydn, who wrote the Creation, Bach, they write such beautiful music, it transcends the human experience. It points towards the divine. This is not merely a genius who can put a lot of notes together. This is something that goes beyond, and I believe music, art, beauty will reasonably show that God exists rather than we are just a material result. Now the next frontier, and I wish we could have a topic in and of itself, psychological studies, at least from my point of view, are now showing scientifically that the Catholic notion of the human person is correct. By way of background, in the 3rd century, a guy named Origen, and I talked about him to Elaine's group here, said that we're created for God. St. Augustine in the 4th century opens up the confessions by saying, God, you gave us